Welcome to the Safety and Risk Success podcast with me, Christian Harris. Helen Underwood is my guest today, and we speak about all things to do with first aid, both physical, mental, and with a bit of focus on first aid skills for parents with kids. That was in particular the reason I was keen to speak to Helen, because I've had experiences of kids being sick as she dealt with in her career as well. But more broadly, I think first aid is something that, as we'll hear when we get into the conversation, we here in the UK could be a little bit better at. And so a reminder, a refresher, and some inspiration from this conversation, I hope, as to why it's an important thing to think about, should be beneficial. As always, if you enjoy this episode and you get some value from it, please give us a like, a comment, and a share on social media, and do hit follow on your podcasting platform of choice. Hope you enjoy this conversation with myself and Helen, all about first aid. Cheers.
Welcome to the Safety and Risk Success podcast with Christian Harris. We believe that proactive safety and risk management powers business performance. Each week we explore this theme, sharing guests, stories, insights, trends, hints and tips. You can find us on all the major podcasting platforms, and video versions are available on YouTube. But for now, let's join the conversation with Christian.
Thanks for joining me today, Helen.
You're welcome, Christian.
I've been looking forward to this for a reason we'll speak about later. So thank you for sharing your time. I thought I'd start by asking, why is first aid a topic that we should care more about?
It's just, I think it's very simply, simple skills save lives. And I used to be a physiotherapist in the NHS, working mostly in intensive care and paediatrics with the sort of sickest of the sick, thankfully way before COVID, because that was a real nightmare for many colleagues of mine who are still in the NHS.
Yeah.
And I just worked with so many people who, if they'd had some first aid straight after the initial accident or incident, whatever you like to call it, they really wouldn't have been in such a bad place. They'd have had such a shorter stay in hospital, a quicker rehabilitation. Their injuries would have been much less severe than they ended up being. And it's just such basic, simple information, notwithstanding that it also saves lives. It's just a
Yeah.
no-brainer.
Mm. And if we think about the UK, because I obviously know most about the UK, albeit the audience is international. I mean, I've got no idea. What proportion of people, have a first aid qualification or a first aid skill set in the UK?
I don't think there's any exact data on that, but it's significantly lower than many countries in Europe, for example. So there were some recent statistics from the Resuscitation Council UK published on their website that you can go and have a look at. And our survival to out of hospital cardiac arrest is really quite low compared to many other countries in Europe. It's as low as fewer than 1 in 12 actually survived hospital
Wow.
discharge, which is incredibly low. Now, in some of the other countries in Europe, which we could compare ourselves with, they actually have a requirement that before the people in their country can sit their driving test, they must have completed a basic first aid qualification. The
Mm.
net result is that we know their out of survival hospital cardiac arrest statistics are so much better. And it's purely that there's a higher percentage of the population trained.
Yeah.
So that just speaks volumes in itself.
Yeah, it's always interesting when you're in a meeting and someone says, who's I went to a conference just before Christmas, and somebody said, "Oh, who's a first aider?" And very few. This was a health and safety conference.
Oh,
Very few
really?
people. Very few people put their hand up. And then he sort of asked the question again, in terms of who has done some first aid training and has some first aid competence, and then a lot more hands went up. I mean, I didn't put my hand up because I have done first aid training, but it was a long, long time ago. So I think you have to renew it, don't you, for it to be sort of valid.
If it's valid for the workplace, yes, it should be
Yeah.
renewed. And the standard for most courses and most industries is 3 years,
Yeah.
although in healthcare it's every 12 months for healthcare
Yeah.
professionals.
Yeah.
But again, any knowledge is great knowledge. And one of my big bugbears is just parents out there. We've got these small human beings who we're responsible for, but so many of us just don't have that essential knowledge for children who can't help themselves.
Yeah, I remember doing NCT, and there was a very light touch piece around first aid, just around, being conscious of the fact that these
Mm.
beings are just so tiny and fragile, and actually, you can't be compressing their chest and in the same way that you can to an adult, obviously, because you're going to cause more damage than you're trying to solve.
Yes and no, in that if you're in the right place, you'll be surprised at how little damage you do to the chest because the rib cage is so incredibly compliant. But having some knowledge and having learnt a little bit of first aid that's relevant to those small people definitely would be helpful to any parent, I feel.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we'll talk more about that later because that was one of the main reasons I wanted to get you on your work in that space. But so if we think about the UK, then there's obviously a legislative difference between the UK and Europe. So there's potentially
Mhm.
some improvements we could make there in that particular example you gave. But how would you say, you know, in the round, the legislation works?
Well, there's a couple of key things. So the main one, of course, is L74, the Health and Safety First Aid at Work regulations, which actually had an update roughly this time last year in 2024, actually. And the new thing for employers is that there is an emphasis from the Health and Safety Executive on them also considering the mental well-being of their
Yeah,
employees as well as the physical well-being. So there's an expectation to think about things such as first aiders for mental health, maybe using employee assistance programs to provide access to things like counselling, for example, would be useful depending on the nature of the workforce and
yeah,
job role and such like as well. Putting things in place to manage stress, workplace stress accounts for a huge number of absences from work each year. I think it was
mm,
16.4 million working days were lost in 23-24 in the UK just to workplace related stress, anxiety, or depression. And that's a huge number, isn't it? And
yeah,
of course, that then impacts on the other employees who are covering for them as well.
yeah, yeah,
So there's a lot that employers can do, but we do have some great legislation there because there is minimum numbers of first aiders required. Employees do need to remember that if it says at least one first aider, really it means at least two because you've
yeah,
got to cover for things like annual leave. So that's often something I find people do miss.
mm,
So there is stuff out there, but it's about I think it's investing in employees if you actually get them to do first aid training because it's a life skill. They may use it with friends and family outside of work as well. And I
yeah,
think it's investing in them as people. And I think the more staff we can train in first aid, the more they can support each other. And then it's not all down onto those one or two people to deal with anything potentially that could actually occur.
yeah, yeah. So if there's I won't say it's a challenge, I'll call it an opportunity. Is it more around the kind of attitudes towards it? In other words, you kind of feel like it sounds like you feel like the legislative side is pretty good. You're not sort of saying it's terrible. Um, but maybe it's just kind of trying to win the hearts and minds of more people to buy into the benefit.
Absolutely, 100%. I mean, I've worked with smaller businesses who've maybe got between 8 and 12 staff, and they've trained the entire staff workforce in a one-day emergency first aid at work course, which just means everybody's a first aider and it doesn't matter who's off, which is fantastic. And I've worked with the larger companies where they've gone with, well, we only need two, so we'll just have two. And you're like, well, but you've got 45 staff and you've only got two and they're different parts of the site and what have you.
Mm,
So I think part of it comes down to people's perception of cost. People are always cost cutting. I think
yeah.
that's the issue. Possibly some willingness to train. I think there is a worry by some people that they may get sued if they do first aid, which is not the case in the UK.
Right.
There is no case that I'm aware of whereas a first aider has actually been sued for doing first aid. Whereas there have been employers who have got into legal difficulties because they've not had a first aider present.
Mm,
And there was no one call the emergency services because they all thought somebody else had done it and no
mm,
one had that role to actually ensure that it happened. So
mm.
I think there are a whole ballgame of different issues. And I think they vary in each and every situation. But a lot of it does come down to releasing staff for the time it does take to take the course, covering staff
Yeah.
for the duration of it, or just down to bottom line cost
Mm,
management.
yeah. So, what kind of strategies have you seen succeed in influencing organizations to kind of go above and beyond the sort of compliance level? As you say, we need two, so therefore we'll have two, uh, to doing something a little bit more holistic and not necessarily training the whole team if you've got a massive organization, but sort of just, just going that bit beyond and taking it a bit more seriously.
I think businesses who've had first aid scares are often better at putting things in place. I can think
Hmm.
of one manufacturing company in particular who've got a defib in every part of their operational site, which means they've actually got four defibs in total on one site, just because it's quite a big site. But they had an employee some years ago actually have a heart attack. So what they do, and actually go into full cardiac arrest as a result of that, I should add.
Hmm.
So what they've actually done is they have their first aiders and they make sure they've got enough for their shift patterns and their different work areas. But then every year they actually do a annual refresher in-person update for those staff where they always include defib training and they refresh those first aiders, which is such an important thing to do, but very few businesses actually do that. So that's
Hmm.
a great success. But they recognise they've an ageing workforce. They recognise there's a risk of sudden illness such as cardiac incidents or strokes, and so therefore they put that training in to support their staff and staff team, which is fantastic. um, I've already mentioned the small family construction firm who trained everybody, and that's a fantastic investment. You've included the office person who,
Hmm.
of course, had family outside of work they might use it for. They weren't on the construction site, but sometimes they might be lone working in the office. So great that they've
Yeah.
got that knowledge as well. Maybe
Hmm.
a delivery driver dropping something off needs some emergency first aid. You never know where you're going to use it.
Yeah.
So I think it's just having the mindset is the big thing that actually is essential. And I was really privileged to go into a sixth form college last year and actually do some first aid for mental health training for the entire senior staff at the college. And that was not only great fun, but a real privilege that they're actually investing in that for their staff as well as for their
Hmm.
students as well to
Yeah.
support them.
No, that's great to hear. It strikes me that it's kind of similar to many aspects within safety where, if something bad hasn't yet happened, people kind of think, oh, well, we must be doing something well, or we're doing fine and it'll be all right, rather than, thinking about, is that just that we've been a bit lucky and actually, should we revisit this and go back to first principles and really try and do it properly? Whereas, yeah, if you have something that does happen, all of a sudden the attention is on it and the focus
Mm.
is there and things change. So do you find that a key part is to try to sort of explain to the organization, what are the sort of ancillary benefits, I suppose, to them, and I guess linking that to some kind of financial performance as well.
Absolutely 100%. And for some businesses, it's just that they're so busy with the nitty gritty everyday stuff that, as you know, health and safety kind of gets left a little bit on the back burner
Can do,
unless
yeah.
happens, as you said. So one of the things that I offer, and you can access this through my website at underwoodtraining.co.uk, is a free first aid needs assessment. So there's just a very simple form to fill in where you can just tell me about key aspects of your organisation, and I'll actually analyse roughly what I think your first aid needs assessment is, what your legal requirement is, but take into account things like the geographical spread of the workforce and shift patterns, etc. I'll actually advise you what would be best practice to have as a minimum, what would be a nice to have. And there's no obligation for doing that for people, but sometimes you just need someone who's got their head around the legislation, the
Yeah.
different areas of first aid. And also, one of the updates with L74 is that you can do first aid training that isn't on the mainstream syllabus of first aid at work and emergency first aid at work if that fits the needs of the business. So, I've been doing a lot of work with Yorkshire Wildlife Trust, who are fantastic to work with. We've got a 16-hour outdoor incident management first aid course that we do. And for their staff working on their nature reserves, that's been absolutely perfect because it's dealing with uneven ground, insulating shelter, outdoor environments. With another company we work with who does a lot of surveys for things to do with pre-building sites and stuff like that. And
Mm.
again, for their staff, that was ideal for them. So it might be that someone like myself can advise you what else is out there. And sometimes that's a better cost-effective solution than the
Yeah.
off-the-peg mainstream courses.
Yeah, that makes sense. I remember chatting. I did a presentation actually to an organization, like an industry organization that deals with those kind of rural and heritage sites,
Mm,
and talking through some of their challenges, as you say, with the types of environments they're dealing with. Um, and they can't sort of put these traditional health and
mm,
safety controls like barriers in place because it spoils the ambiance, or it's a listed building or whatever it might be. So,
yeah.
um, yeah, so lots of things can and do, and they've got typically an more elderly um, uh, population visiting them. So yeah, lots of things can and do happen there. So yeah, glad to hear that that organisation is taking that taking it seriously, and trying to, you know, if you can't prevent an incident from happening, at least you can respond to it quickly and professionally. And as you said at the start, that can massively improve the outcomes.
100%.
Yeah. So what kind of inspired you to go from that physiotherapist role into this world?
Well, it was an interesting route, actually. So, I don't think some of your listeners know, but I spent 11 years working in the NHS in a mixture of places like intensive care and paediatric intensive care as a physiotherapist. And basically, I burnt out, to be honest. It was very hardcore working with the sickest of the sick all the time.
Mhm.
And I actually ran away to Scotland for a year, and I did outdoor pursuits instructor training. So I qualified in taking people rock climbing, canoeing, kayaking, all sorts of random disciplines.
All
And it
the
was
stuff to
actually
cause the injuries.
no, actually,
I'm
funnily
joking.
enough, because you risk assessment and
Yeah.
you set the what you're doing to the skill set of the group that you're taking into the outdoors. So
Yeah.
surprisingly enough, outdoor environments for sports coaching actually have a lower injury percentage, I think, than many workplaces.
Yeah.
Looking at the
Wouldn't surprise
HSE
me. Yeah. Mm.
statistics, so you would think so, but as a result of that, it is a requirement that all sports coaches have to have a certain level of first aid linking in with their coaching qualification, or their coaching qualification is invalid and
Yeah.
unusable while their first aid is out of date. So it's actually one of the visiting assessors who said, Helen, have you thought about first aid training with your background? And the rest, as they say, is history. Goalposts have moved. I've had to do teacher training qualifications after I got my first aid trainer qualifications and jumped through various other hoops. HSE approvals for first aid went, and things have moved in other directions. So there's been lots of changes in the industry.
Mm.
But I love what I do now. I love not being on call overnight. I love the
Yeah.
variety of people I meet, and I love the huge variety of different first aid training that I'm able to deliver.
Mm. And having that experience, and to be able to share the stories and the insights of seeing, as you say, the kind of sickest of the sick people, I imagine it must be very powerful because, you know, like you said earlier, with sometimes people don't act until something bad happens.
Mm.
You can give examples of where something bad has happened and where actually it could have been better had they just done this, as you say, small, simple, relatively thing, and hopefully that will inspire people.
Think so, but it is a bit of a double-edged sword. So I try really hard not to use lots of examples for every single topic on a course, because I think I might scare people witless.
Yeah.
But equally, there is absolutely nothing that we teach on a first aid course that I have not at some point dealt with,
Mm.
even if it's been in intensive care in the aftermath of the incident. So, any part of the body you can break, big burns, meningococcal septicemia, anything you can think of on a course, I've dealt
Mm.
with that at some point and been involved in the care of someone with that
Yeah.
condition. And that does mean that I've never yet had a question that I can't actually answer on a course. I do try very hard not to be overly medical with saying things and explaining in that way. And I love LinkedIn gave a lovely review for the end of the year on their co-author thing. I don't know if any of other listeners have done that, but it stated that my superpower is making medical complexity into simple life-saving skills or such words. And I love
Yeah.
that. It's
Yeah.
fantastic.
That's good.
So yeah, but I can give stories where it's needed for sure.
Yeah. Well, that sounds like we need to throw out a challenge to people to ask questions in the when we post about this to see if there's a question you can't answer.
It's got to look with first aid, not surgery. That's the
Yeah,
caveat.
yeah, no, we can't. Yeah, you can't be asking. That would be unfair. We can't be doing that to you. We'll see if anybody can come up with anything
That'd be
and
great.
stump you. And I'm sure they won't. I'm sure they won't manage to do that. Um, I did a lot of physio. Actually, I was run over by a car. I don't know if you heard the story. I was
No,
run over
I'm
by a
sorry to hear
car
that.
in 2012. I was walking down the pavement, and a car came around the corner, lost control, and mounted the curb and sort of ploughed into me. So yeah, I had to do quite a lot of physio as a result of that. So not I wasn't in intensive care for more than I don't know a few hours, I guess. Then I got discharged to a ward. I had a broken collarbone and broken wrist and broken ankle and all that sort of stuff, but nothing too bad in the grand scheme of things.
Well, you've recovered well, which is the main thing, but I'm so sorry you went through that.
Yeah, yeah, and I think I mean I can't remember it, but I my impression from my wife, 'cause she was with me, it was that the ambulance came quite quickly, and yeah, so I think I got pretty good care.
One of the amazing
So
things in the UK, isn't it? Our emergency services are absolutely fantastic. And I don't think we
yeah,
give them the credit they deserve.
no, well, I think sometimes people have bad experiences with the NHS and healthcare, and they sort of forget that there are different elements to it. And I think you're right. If somebody's really sick and it's critical and it's time sensitive, we are great at that. Particularly when it comes to kids. I mean, my oldest son, I don't think ever had to go in, but my youngest son, a couple of times, has had to go into um, uh, intensive care actually once with an asthma attack. But you know, through A&E and so on, and yeah, just amazing, amazing.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things with first aid training as well. It's a real privilege to be able to educate people as to the level of response that you should actually be going for, because quite often with workplace injuries, we don't need an ambulance. If
Mm,
someone's just got an injury to a wrist, we could actually arrange transport to the nearest minor injuries,
yeah,
and it would take the pressure off the ambulance service for those with a more serious need. So
yeah,
I always think about big sick or little sick when I'm teaching adults about the first aid and about where you're prioritising it.
mm,
There are, of course, cases where you can't take someone because they're immobile, such as a leg injury, but
yeah,
you're going to have to deal with the longer wait if it's not serious.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, I remember. I won't say any names, but I remember in my late teens playing in a football match, and one of my teammates got into a fight with one of the opponents, and they both got sent off. Um, my teammate got his nose quite badly broken, um, and I ended up taking him into hospital, and because that was obviously not very serious, and he was, you know, the age he was and stuff, he was there for hours and hours on end, um, and he deserved to be for what he did, obviously, although he got the worst of it. But yeah, whereas with the kids, they straight in, no messing around. You know, when it's serious, yeah, we are very good at that. I have
Yeah.
to say, yeah. So we've sort of went off in a bit of a tangent there, but that's all good. That's what podcasts and conversations are all about. We don't want to be pre-scripting stuff. We want to be going off and seeing where the conversation takes us, which is good. So, what would you say have been some of the challenges that you've faced building your business, bearing in mind some of the context that we've spoken about?
I think one of the biggest challenges to start with definitely has to be moving from the NHS as a clinician into owning a business and running a business, because I just didn't have any of that running a business type skill set
Hmm.
that people who've got their own businesses will know all about. And I think you take it for granted when someone does the payroll and someone else does the finance and someone deals with the HR and all the rest of it. And certainly once I started employing other staff, that's a whole nother ball game, because there's so
Hmm.
many bits of legislation that you have to follow. So my amazing person that I've met is a lovely lady called Antonia who runs her own HR business, and I now just outsource any HR to her. If I've got any queries, I just
Yeah.
drop her an email or send her a message and just go, need to know about this, or need a new contract for this, or whatever else. And she'll just sort it. And that means I know that I'm on the straight and narrow legally with that. So that's been an absolute massive help.
Mm.
Um, Getting your head around doing things like social media. Again, it's another skill set, but having the time to commit to that when you're busy delivering training courses, it's quite a neat thing. I have recently learned how to schedule, which is great, but I haven't quite learned how to tag people in the same way
Right.
when I do that. So I'm working on that. Um, Particularly on Instagram, it doesn't like you tagging collaborators if you do it in advance, I've discovered.
I
So
see. Okay. Didn't know that.
I've learned that recently. There's probably a workaround I haven't yet worked, so someone might send us a message on that on the podcast chat as well, mightn't they? So things like that have been a real challenge, and the biggest challenge of all had to be COVID, as I'm sure you
Yeah.
found for many small businesses. It's taken till about now to bounce back from it
Mm.
because of the 3-year renewal cycle that is from
Yeah.
first aid. It's
Yeah.
about now that we've got to renewals being at full size cohorts.
Mm.
So that's been quite a bind, really. So there's
Mm.
been a few little bumps along the way, but I like to think of them as learning curves
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
challenges.
No, that's yeah. You have to do that. The piece around outsourcing, I think, is really important. And I don't know if you use this analogy, but when I speak to health and safety professionals or facilities management professionals or whoever it is that I'm sort of engaging with from the perspective of my business, I often use the analogy of a GP versus a surgeon. So if
Mm,
you're a health and safety manager or if you're a MD of a small business, you have to kind of have a very broad base of knowledge because you've got to spin all those plates. Um, but obviously, if your knowledge is very, very broad, it can only ever be shallow. Um, and
100%.
so, it's always worth, in my opinion, someone like you in your area, or me in my area, or your HR person in her area, finding somebody who's more of a rather than being a GP, where you have that shallow but broad knowledge, find a surgeon where it's an inch wide and a mile deep and get them in to help. And I think that's always a good way of going. And then you can rely on that person and their expertise.
I love that analogy. I've never used it, but I'm going to start borrowing it. Thank you.
Yeah, no worries. I put it in my book, so I don't mind talking about it. But it's one that people get because the GP diagnoses, but they don't necessarily all. They can treat sometimes, of course, but
Mm,
sometimes actually you need that bit of specialist help and you can trying to treat something if you're not really sure, and it can be pretty serious. It's not something you should be wanting to do. I think
100%.
often people will, perhaps under pressure from colleagues, or perhaps under their own internal pressure, feel as if they've got to sort of do everything themselves. And both from a sort of functional role within a business or as a small business owner, I think it's really actually freeing to to feel no, I'm not going to do everything myself. I'm going to look to find some help where it's needed and where my skill set doesn't align and sort of get that pressure off me,
100%.
which is good for your mental health as well, I'm sure.
Definitely. And, when I had some recent employee changes and change of who my admin person was, just saying to Antonia, actually, I just want you to do all of this because it takes some of it off my caseload
Yeah,
and off my plate was just very
yeah,
freeing indeed.
yeah, definitely, definitely. So let's go back to kids and being a parent and so on and so forth. So um, I alluded to and spoke about my son and his asthma and things like that. And actually, when I heard about what you were up to in this space, I thought, oh, this is going to be the piece around first aid is important anyway, and I think it's something that deserves a light to be shone on it. But B, I thought this in particular, is very interesting what you're doing and very relevant to a lot of people. So um, I know the answer to this, but tell the story as to what inspired you to go down this route of providing first aid for parents course.
Well, I've been delivering first aid for parents courses for umpteen years, ever since I
Yeah.
was in a business networking group years ago. And there were two other members of the group who said, we're expecting baby number one. What do we do when Bump is born and they're weaning and they choke or when they hit their head? And so I did a first aid for parents course, and they were always in person. But a few years ago, I made very good friends when I had my own daughter with a friend who had a child around the same time. Sadly, they lost that child through a genetic condition, and a few years later had a second child and were blessed with another child who had a couple of floppy blue episodes where they were rushed into hospital by a super fast, amazing ambulance crew. And on the second time such case, they stayed in for a few days. Nothing particular was found, and they were discharged home and phoned me and said, Helen, we've got a favour to ask you. You can say no, but we're going to ask you anyway, and it's okay if you want to say no, but we're going to ask you. They wouldn't teach us at hospital, but would you teach us how to do CPR for our baby should we need it? And I just went, of course I will. And I shot round that night, armed with a baby mannequin, and taught them how to deal with CPR and choking incidents with a young baby. And it was just a few days later that my friend actually had to give rescue breaths to their daughter. She's now in primary school. She's quite a lot bigger. So we're going back a few years. But my heart always goes, but what if I hadn't gone round? What
Mm.
if I hadn't gone round? Would she still be here? And I just don't have an answer to that, and can't bear thinking about it.
Mm.
But simple skills really do save lives. And as simple as opening an airway, if someone's gone unresponsive and that tongue has blocked the throat, could be enough. And that could be just on a faint because someone's overheated.
Yep.
Um, we've already talked about CPR and the survival outcomes in the UK compared to some other parts of Europe. The NHS has states on their website that a lot of deaths could be actually avoided, or a lot of injuries a lot less worse if first aid was given at the time of the accident or incident.
Yep.
It's a no-brainer. So I'd been dreaming about creating this course into a virtual thing for quite a few years. Various hiatuses like having a child and COVID and things
Yep.
actually got in the way. And I discovered that video editing is actually quite a longer, more involved skill than I anticipated, as I've
Yep.
completely filmed and edited the course myself. But First Aid for Parents has now gone live. It is called Big Sick, Little Sick First Aid for Parents for reasons I think we've already discussed. Is this a big thing or a little thing?
Yep.
Do I need that GP, or actually can I just nip to a pharmacist? Is this just
Yep.
a mummy push the fluids, a daddy cuddle thing? What's
Yep.
going on? And I've covered all of the main core topics that I normally did in the course when I did it in person, but also some of the extras of the things that I'd regularly get asked by parents.
Yep.
So there's everything from high temperature illnesses, chokings, unresponsive children and babies, CPR, but there's also child specific information for dealing with those much smaller people that you mentioned earlier as well. And a little bit on weaning and allergies as well, because that's always a concern for new parents, I find.
Mhm. And you launched it late last year, didn't you? I think. How's it gone so
Yes.
far?
It's getting there slowly. Unfortunately, as I launched it, I also ended up doing staff changes with needing to hire a new admin. So I didn't get quite as much energy into the launch as I'd hoped. But it's starting to gain a little bit of traction. And I'm just really excited to get it out there to
Mm.
the massive. So it's me, a parent, and an ex NHS healthcare professional with paediatric expertise talking to people. I've made sure I've been very careful not to go too technical. I've tried
Yep.
not to be too scary, but I've given you, this is the way it is. It's black, it's white. Do this, so you do your best. If you're not sure, this is where you get help. These are your routes for help. And I've also broken it down into very small sections.
Yep.
So, for example, choking. Every parent's nightmare, isn't it? Choking with a young child. It's actually in initial section about those who are still making noise. Then there's actually teenagers and adults, smaller children, and then babies under 12 months. And I've actually split it into the 4 videos so that you
Mm.
can watch it in little bits,
Yeah.
short time bursts with small children in tow, but also so you can refine the bit that you want quickly should you ever want to go back to it. So I'm hoping that it will make a massive difference to somebody out there who uses it, and those skills will be really, really useful to them.
Yeah, I'm sure it will. And I mean, hopefully, somebody might listen to this and think, oh, I should do that for my organization and give that as a benefit to people because you know, there's so you have we both know as a parent, especially the first time round, there's so much on your plate. And this is the sort of thing that actually might get missed within among everything else, if you know what I mean. But as you've alluded to with the example you gave, could just be literally the difference between life and death.
It can be, but also from an employer's point of view to an employee, if you think about L74 and the change in legislation, we're supposed to consider employees' mental well-being. What
Hmm.
says more to your employee about I care about you and your family if you're offering this to them? And it doesn't just have to be to those who are parents, but they might be grandparents, they might be aunts or uncles, they might stand in as carers. So the other benefit, of course, was two benefits actually. One is if people do it, if they can spot children becoming poorly more quickly, they may be able to get them along to a GP or other
Yeah.
urgent care setting more quickly. They're less poorly overall. There's less time off work, absent from the workplace, caring for that child because they've recovered quicker. They've not got so
Hmm.
sick. That's number
Yeah.
one. Number two, you're upskilling more of your workforce in general first aid. So if there is an incident on site, you've got more people who can deal with it and support your first aiders within the business. So just on those two things alone, it's
Hmm.
surely got to be worth a hit at just £30 a head, including that. It's a real
Yeah.
bargain, I think, to upskill
Yeah.
your workforce.
Absolutely. And we'll definitely include some links and info on that in the show notes.
That'd be
Um,
amazing. Thank you.
yeah, no, pleasure. So, other than that, Helen, the digital course for parents, just quickly give us an overview of what the business does. So, if somebody has been inspired by this conversation to do some more in this area, how can you help, I suppose?
If you're a larger business or even a medium business and you're not sure what you need, get in touch with me. I'll do a free first aid needs assessment, or we can just have a chat over the phone. Happy to help you work out what you need and what your options are. We obviously do the mainstream first aid at work, emergency first aid at work courses, and also the first aid for mental health courses. But if you're a specialist setting, we've got the paediatric first aid course, the outdoor incident management course, and the aquatic course for those who work in and around water-based environments as well. I've also got some sports-based courses I regularly do for a couple of clients as well. There's shorter things. I've gone into workplaces and done just anaphylaxis and asthma training when they've got employees with particular needs. So literally, if it's first aid linked, I can help you with pretty much anything. So that there is loads out there. All the main courses are featured on the website. So that's obviously a go-to place if you want to see what we do. I'm also regularly on LinkedIn and a little bit on Facebook and Instagram. So connect with me on LinkedIn and have a chat there if you prefer. And yeah, anything to do with first aid. It's all I do, but there is just so many areas to it and so many slants. It
Yeah.
keeps life very interesting.
Definitely, definitely. Great. Well, look, hopefully people will get in touch, and obviously wish you the very best particularly with your first aid for parents course. Um, just to finish off, then I suppose, Helen, is there any one key sort of message that you'd like to get out to the audience, or one or two key messages that you'd really like people to remember from this conversation?
My biggest mission is just sharing that simple skills save lives, because that's what my real passion is just to get that out there. So if you've been thinking about doing a first aid course, pull your finger out and get yourself booked on one. If you're near Leeds, that's where I'm based, but obviously this is going out to a much wider audience. So, whether it's a taster like the virtual first aid for parents course or a more in-person course, whatever's right for your circumstances, of course. But knowledge really is power when it comes to saving lives.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Helen. Really enjoyed it, and wishing you all the best.
Thank you so very much. It's been lovely chatting with you.
Cheers.
Thanks for joining us on the Safety and Risk Success podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please hit follow and do share on social media. Does anyone you know spring to mind as a great guest, even yourself? If so, please contact us on podcast@slipsafety.co.uk. See you next week for another episode.